The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the small forward operating base in Afghanistan. Dust swirled around the makeshift medical tent as Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her surgical mask and checked her equipment one more time. She had been deployed as a field medic for 3 months now, and every day brought new challenges that tested not just her medical skills, but her resolve. Sarah never imagined she would find herself in this position. Just 2 years ago, she was living a completely different life in San Francisco, working as a pediatric surgeon at a prestigious children's hospital. Her days were filled with delicate surgeries on tiny hearts and the grateful smiles of parents whose children she had saved. She had a comfortable apartment overlooking the bay, a reliable routine, and what most people would consider a perfect life. But perfect lives sometimes hide the deepest wounds. The sound of helicopters approaching snapped Sarah back to the present. She could hear the familiar whir of rotor blades cutting through the desert air, growing louder by the second. Her heart rate quickened as she recognized the urgency in the pilot's radio chatter. Incoming casualties, multiple wounded, critical condition. "Doc, we've got company coming in hot," called out Sergeant Martinez, the base communications officer, as he rushed toward the medical tent. "SEAL team took heavy fire during a night raid. 4 wounded, 2 critical." Sarah's hands moved automatically, checking her supplies and preparing the trauma bay. She had done this countless times before, but something about this particular call sent a chill down her spine. SEAL teams were elite warriors, trained to handle the most dangerous missions. If they were in trouble, it meant the situation had been truly dire. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of sand and debris. Sarah pulled her goggles down and rushed toward the aircraft as the crew chief began unloading stretchers. The first casualty was conscious but pale, clutching his shoulder where blood seeped through his tactical vest. The second was unconscious, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. But it was the third stretcher that made Sarah's world stop spinning. Even covered in dust and blood, even with his face partially obscured by an oxygen mask, she recognized him immediately. The same strong jawline she had traced with her fingers in the darkness of her apartment. The same scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident he had told her about during one of their long conversations over coffee. The same hands that had once held hers as they planned a future together. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, her former fiancé, the man she had loved with every fiber of her being. The man who had shattered her heart into a million pieces when he chose his military career over their relationship. Sarah's hands trembled as she approached his stretcher, her medical training warring with the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Jake's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and labored. A piece of shrapnel protruded from his chest, dangerously close to his heart. Blood pooled beneath him on the stretcher, and his pulse was weak and thready. "What's his status?" Sarah asked the Navy corpsman who had been treating him during the flight, forcing her voice to remain steady and professional. "Penetrating chest wound, possible pneumothorax. He's been in and out of consciousness since we picked him up. Lost a lot of blood, Doc. We need to get him into surgery immediately." Sarah nodded, pushing aside every personal feeling and focusing on what needed to be done. Jake was dying, and she was the only surgeon within 100 miles who could save him. Their past, their broken engagement, the words they had spoken in anger during their final fight, none of that mattered now. Only his life mattered. As they wheeled Jake into the surgical tent, Sarah caught a glimpse of his dog tags. Morrison, Jacob D. Blood type O negative. Next of kin, Sarah Chen. Her name was still listed as his emergency contact even after all this time, even after everything that had happened between them. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had fled to this war-torn desert to escape the pain of losing him, only to have fate deliver him back into her hands when he needed her most. But this Jake was different from the man she had known. This wasn't the confident, invincible SEAL who had walked away from their relationship. This was a broken, vulnerable human being whose life hung by a thread. Sarah scrubbed her hands methodically, the familiar ritual helping to calm her nerves. Through the thin walls of the surgical tent, she could hear the other members of Jake's team being treated for their injuries. They were asking about their commander, their voices tight with concern and barely controlled emotion. She had to save him, not just because she was a doctor and had sworn an oath to do no harm, but because these brave men were counting on her. They had risked everything to serve their country, and now one of their own was fighting for his life under her care. But as Sarah approached the operating table and looked down at Jake's unconscious form, she couldn't help but wonder if he would want her help if he knew who was about to operate on him. The last words they had spoken to each other had been filled with hurt and resentment. He had accused her of not understanding his duty to his country. She had accused him of choosing the military over their love. Now, 3 years later, his life was literally in her hands. Sarah took a deep breath and picked up her scalpel. Personal feelings would have to wait. Right now, she wasn't Sarah Chen, the woman whose heart Jake Morrison had broken. She was Dr. Chen, trauma surgeon, and she had a life to save. The operation began in tense silence, with only the steady beep of monitors and the quiet instructions Sarah gave to her medical team breaking the stillness. The shrapnel had missed his heart by millimeters, but it had punctured his lung and caused significant internal bleeding. Every second counted. As Sarah worked, memories flooded back unbidden. Jake teaching her to surf on a weekend getaway to Santa Barbara, the way he looked in his dress blues at military ceremonies, the engagement ring he had given her, a simple solitaire that had once seemed like the most beautiful thing in the world, the plans they had made for their wedding, their future, the children they would have. All of it had crumbled when Jake received orders for an extended deployment. Sarah had begged him to request a transfer, to consider leaving the military, to choose their relationship over his career. But Jake had been unwavering in his commitment to his team and his mission. He couldn't abandon his men, he had said. They needed him. "I need you too," Sarah had whispered that night, tears streaming down her face. "I know," Jake had replied, his own voice breaking. "But this is who I am, Sarah. This is what I do. I can't change that." The engagement had ended that night. Sarah had removed her ring and placed it on the kitchen counter, unable to look at him as he gathered his things and walked out of her life forever. She had thought she would never see him again. Now, here he was, unconscious and bleeding on her operating table, completely dependent on her skills to survive. The universe had a cruel sense of humor sometimes. Hours passed as Sarah carefully removed the shrapnel and repaired the damage to Jake's lung. Her team worked with quiet efficiency, anticipating her needs and providing support without question. This was what she lived for: the intense focus of surgery, the delicate dance between life and death, the satisfaction of using her skills to heal. Finally, as dawn broke over the desert base, Sarah completed the last suture and stepped back from the table. Jake's vital signs had stabilized, and the color was slowly returning to his face. He would live, though his recovery would be long and difficult. "Excellent work, Doc," said her surgical assistant, a young corpsman named Williams who had been deployed for only 2 weeks. "That was some of the finest trauma surgery I've ever witnessed." Sarah nodded her thanks, exhaustion suddenly hitting her like a physical blow. She had been operating for nearly 6 hours straight, and the emotional toll of the situation was finally catching up with her. She needed to check on her other patients and file her reports, but first she needed a moment to collect herself. As she walked outside the surgical tent, Sarah was surprised to find the other members of Jake's SEAL team waiting anxiously nearby. They were an intimidating group, tall, muscular men with hard eyes and battle-worn faces. But as she approached them, she could see the genuine concern and affection they had for their commander. "How is he, Doc?" asked a tall man with sergeant's stripes. His left arm was in a sling, but he seemed oblivious to his own injury as he focused entirely on news of Jake. "The surgery went well," Sarah replied. "He's stable, but it was touch and go for a while. The next 24 hours will be critical, but I'm cautiously optimistic." The relief on their faces was palpable. These were men trained to hide their emotions, but the bond between them and their leader was unmistakable. "Thank you, Doc," said another team member, a younger man with intense blue eyes. "The lieutenant commander is a good man. Best officer I've ever served under. We don't know what we'd do without him." Sarah felt a familiar ache in her chest at their words. She had always known that Jake inspired fierce loyalty in the men who served under him. It was one of the things that had attracted her to him in the first place: his natural leadership, his integrity, his unwavering commitment to protecting others. It was also one of the things that had ultimately destroyed their relationship. "He's not out of the woods yet," Sarah cautioned. "He'll need to be evacuated to a larger medical facility once he's stable enough for transport, but he's strong, and he's a fighter." As the SEAL team members dispersed to tend to their own injuries and duties, Sarah remained outside the medical tent, watching the sun rise over the harsh desert landscape. She thought about the choices that had led her to this moment: the decision to leave her comfortable life in San Francisco, the painful process of rebuilding herself after Jake had left, the unexpected path that had brought her to Afghanistan as a military contractor. She had told herself that she came here to serve her country, to use her skills to help wounded warriors. But if she was being honest, she had also come here to prove something to herself. To prove that she could be strong, independent, and valuable without Jake in her life. To prove that she didn't need him to define her worth. Now, having saved his life, Sarah wasn't sure what she felt. Relief that she had been able to help him? Vindication that her skills had been crucial when he needed them most? Or simply the hollow satisfaction of knowing that she had done her duty as a doctor, regardless of their personal history? Inside the recovery tent, Jake lay unconscious, unaware that the woman who had once loved him more than life itself had just performed a miracle to keep him alive. He didn't know that Sarah was here, didn't know that she had held his life in her hands and chosen to save him despite the pain he had caused her. Sarah walked back into the medical tent to check on her patients, pushing aside her complicated emotions and focusing on the work that needed to be done. There would be time later to process what had happened, to figure out what it all meant. For now, Jake Morrison was alive, and that was enough. 3 days had passed since the surgery, and Jake Morrison lay in the recovery tent, drifting in and out of consciousness. The medications kept him in a hazy twilight state, aware enough to know he was injured, but not clear enough to understand exactly where he was or who was treating him. Every time he tried to speak, his throat felt raw, and his voice came out as barely a whisper. Sarah had been avoiding his bedside as much as possible, assigning the nursing care to her medical staff while she focused on other patients. She told herself it was professional. She needed to maintain objectivity and couldn't let personal feelings interfere with his care. But the truth was, she wasn't ready to face him when he was conscious. She wasn't ready for the conversation that would inevitably come. The forward operating base had settled into its usual routine after the dramatic rescue operation. Supply convoys came and went, patrols headed out into the desert, and the steady stream of injured soldiers continued to flow through the medical tent. Sarah threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, staying busy enough that she didn't have time to think about the unconscious SEAL lying 20 feet away. But Jake's team members weren't making it easy for her to avoid the situation. They had taken shifts sitting by his bedside, maintaining a constant vigil that spoke to their deep bond with their commander. Sarah couldn't help but observe their interactions, even from a distance. Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson was the team's senior enlisted man, a grizzled veteran with 20 years of service and enough combat experience to fill several lifetimes. Despite his intimidating appearance, Sarah watched him gently adjust Jake's pillow and speak to him in low, reassuring tones, even when Jake was unconscious. "You better get your butt up soon, sir," Marcus would say quietly. "The boys are starting to think they can run this team without you, and we both know that's a disaster waiting to happen." Petty Officer First Class. David Rabbit Rodriguez was the team's communications specialist. A wiry young man from Texas with an infectious grin and an uncanny ability to fix anything electronic. He had been hit by shrapnel in the same firefight that wounded Jake, but his injuries were minor compared to his commander's. Rabbit spent hours by Jake's bedside, talking about everything and nothing. Updates from home, sports scores, gossip from the base, anything to fill the silence. The team's medic, Hospital Corpsman Second Class Alex Chen, no relation to Sarah despite sharing a surname, was perhaps the most affected by Jake's condition. As the team's medical expert, Alex blamed himself for not being able to stabilize Jake's injuries in the field more effectively. Sarah had tried to reassure him that his quick thinking and battlefield medicine had probably saved Jake's life, but Alex remained convinced he could have done more. The youngest member of the team was Petty Officer Second Class Tommy "Kid" Sullivan, barely 22 years old, but already a veteran of multiple deployments. The kid had hero worship written all over his face every time he looked at Jake. Sarah learned from overheard conversations that Jake had personally mentored Tommy, helping him through the grueling SEAL training program and taking him under his wing during his first deployment. "He saved my life in Mosul," Tommy told Marcus one evening as they sat by Jake's bedside. "Not just physically, but mentally. I was ready to quit, ready to ring the bell and walk away from everything. But the lieutenant commander sat me down and told me that being scared didn't make me weak. It made me human. He said the brave ones are the ones who feel the fear and do their job anyway." Sarah found herself drawn to these stories despite her best efforts to maintain distance. Every conversation revealed another layer of Jake's character, another example of the leadership and compassion that had made him the kind of officer his men would follow anywhere. It was the same quality that had attracted her to him years ago, and hearing about it now brought back a flood of complicated emotions. On the fourth night after surgery, Sarah was making her evening rounds when she heard voices coming from Jake's area of the recovery tent. She approached quietly, intending to check his vital signs, but stopped when she realized Jake was finally awake and talking to his team. His voice was weak and hoarse, but unmistakably his. "What happened to the target?" he was asking. "Did we complete the mission?" "Mission accomplished, sir," Marcus replied. "Package secured. No civilian casualties. You did good." "The team? Everyone okay?" Jake's voice was filled with concern for his men, even as he lay recovering from life-threatening injuries. "Rabbit took some shrapnel in the shoulder, Tommy has a concussion, and I've got a few stitches," Marcus reported. "But we're all walking and talking thanks to you covering our extract." Sarah felt her heart constrict as she listened to the conversation. Even semi-conscious and wounded, Jake's first thoughts were for his mission and his men. It was exactly the kind of selfless dedication that had made her fall in love with him, and exactly the kind of commitment that had ultimately destroyed their relationship. "The doc who worked on you," Alex was saying. "She saved your life, sir. Best trauma surgery I've ever seen. You were circling the drain when they brought you in, but she pulled you back." Jake was quiet for a moment. "What's her name?" he asked finally. Sarah held her breath, knowing that this moment would change everything. Once Jake knew she was here, there would be no more avoiding the conversation, no more pretending that their past didn't exist. "Dr. Chen," Marcus replied. "She's been taking real good care of you, sir. Haven't seen a surgeon work like that since my last deployment to Iraq." Sarah waited for recognition to dawn in Jake's voice, for him to make the connection. But there was only silence for a long moment. "I'd like to thank her," Jake said finally. "When I'm feeling up to it." More silence. Sarah realized with a mixture of relief and disappointment that Jake hadn't connected her name with the woman he had once planned to marry. Of course, Chen was a common surname, and he had no reason to expect his ex-fiancée to be working as a combat surgeon in Afghanistan. The conversation continued for a few more minutes before Jake drifted back to sleep, exhausted by the effort of staying conscious for even that brief time. His team members settled in for another night of watching over him, their devotion to their leader both touching and heartbreaking. Sarah retreated to her small office area, where she sat staring at Jake's medical chart without really seeing it. She had known this moment would come eventually, when Jake would want to meet the surgeon who had saved his life. But she hadn't prepared herself for how it would feel to hear his voice again, to witness firsthand the depth of loyalty he inspired in his men. The next morning brought another crisis that temporarily pushed Sarah's personal dilemma to the background. A roadside bomb had exploded under a convoy 20 miles from the base, resulting in multiple casualties with severe burns and traumatic injuries. Sarah spent the entire day in surgery, working desperately to save lives and repair the kind of devastating damage that only modern warfare could inflict. By the time she emerged from the operating room, it was nearly midnight. Her surgical scrubs were stained with blood, her hands cramped from hours of delicate work, and exhaustion weighed on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had managed to save 3 of the 4 casualties. But one young soldier hadn't made it despite her best efforts. Sarah stumbled toward her quarters, desperate for a few hours of sleep before the next crisis inevitably arrived. But as she passed through the recovery tent, she noticed that Jake was awake and alone. His team members had finally been ordered to get some rest, leaving him staring up at the tent ceiling with an expression of deep thoughtfulness. "Dr. Chen," he called softly as she passed his bed. Sarah froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned slowly to face him, wondering if this was the moment he would recognize her. But his eyes held no recognition, only gratitude and curiosity. "I wanted to thank you," Jake continued, his voice still weak but stronger than it had been the day before. "My men told me what you did for me. I know I wouldn't be here without your skill." Sarah moved closer to his bedside, studying his face in the dim light of the tent. He looked older than she remembered, with new lines around his eyes and a scar on his temple that hadn't been there when they were together. The years of combat and leadership had left their mark, but his essential character, the integrity and strength that had first attracted her, was still clearly visible. "You're welcome," she said simply, keeping her voice neutral and professional. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Jake replied with a weak smile. "But alive, which I'm told is something of a miracle." "You lost a lot of blood and had significant trauma to your chest cavity," Sarah explained, falling back on medical terminology to maintain distance. "The recovery will take time, but you should make a full recovery." Jake studied her face in the dim light, and for a moment Sarah was certain he was about to recognize her. But instead, he simply nodded and said, "Thank you. I know you probably see a lot of wounded soldiers, but this means everything to me and to my team." "It's what I'm here for," Sarah replied. They talked for a few more minutes about his recovery timeline and what to expect in the coming days. Jake was intelligent and asked good questions about his treatment, displaying the same analytical mind that had made him an excellent military strategist. Throughout the conversation, Sarah found herself relaxing despite herself, falling back into the easy rhythm of conversation they had once shared. It wasn't until Jake mentioned his hometown in Colorado that Sarah felt a jolt of recognition. He was talking about his family, about how worried they would be when they heard about his injuries, and something in his voice when he mentioned someone special made her stomach clench. "Is there someone you'd like me to contact?" Sarah asked, immediately regretting the question. "Your emergency contact information might be outdated." Jake was quiet for a moment. "No," he said finally. "There's no one. Not anymore." The sadness in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her heart break a little for both of them. Whatever his life had been like in the 3 years since they had separated, it was clear that he hadn't found the happiness and fulfillment she had hoped he would discover. "I used to be engaged," Jake continued, surprising Sarah with his sudden candor. "Long time ago. She was a doctor too, actually. Surgeon in San Francisco. I thought we'd have this perfect life together, you know. But I couldn't give her what she needed. Couldn't be the man she deserved." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "What happened?" "I chose my duty over our relationship," Jake said, his voice filled with old pain. "I convinced myself that I was being noble, that my men needed me more than she did. But the truth is, I was probably just scared. Scared of the kind of vulnerability that real love requires. By the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late." The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. Here was Jake, pouring out his heart about their failed relationship to the very woman he had lost, while having no idea who she was. And here was Sarah, learning for the first time that he regretted his choice, that their breakup had haunted him just as much as it had haunted her. "Have you ever tried to contact her?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake shook his head. What would be the point? The damage was done. Besides, she's probably moved on, found someone who can give her the life she deserves, someone who won't choose duty over love. Sarah wanted to tell him that she had never moved on, that no one had ever come close to replacing him in her heart. She wanted to reveal who she was and tell him that she understood now why he had made the choice he had made. She wanted to say that 3 years of war and suffering had taught her the value of duty and service, that she no longer saw his commitment to his men as a betrayal of their love, but as an expression of the very character she had fallen in love with. But instead, she simply said, "You should get some rest. Recovery requires sleep." As Sarah turned to leave, Jake called after her. "Doctor, I know this is unprofessional, but there's something familiar about you. Have we met before?" Sarah's heart stopped. This was her chance to tell him the truth, to reveal who she was and begin the conversation they both needed to have. But looking at his weakened state, his vulnerable expression, she realized that this wasn't the right time. He needed to focus on healing, on recovering his strength. The emotional shock of learning her identity could wait until he was better able to handle it. "I don't think so," Sarah replied. "Afghanistan is a small place. Maybe we've crossed paths at another base." Jake nodded, but his eyes remained thoughtful as Sarah left the tent. She had bought herself more time. But she knew it was only temporary. Eventually, the truth would come out. Eventually, they would have to face their past and decide what, if anything, their future might hold. For now, though, Sarah was content to watch over him from a distance, to ensure his recovery proceeded smoothly, and to listen to the stories his team told about the man he had become. With each passing day, she was learning that the Jake Morrison, who lay in that hospital bed, was both exactly the same and completely different from the man she had once known. He was still driven by duty and honor, still willing to sacrifice everything for his men and his mission. But there was also a depth of wisdom and regret that spoke to the cost of the choices he had made. As Sarah finally made her way to her quarters, she wondered what would happen when Jake was strong enough to handle the truth. Would he be angry that she had deceived him? Would he be happy to see her again? Or would the pain of their past prove too much to overcome? Only time would tell, but for the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt a flicker of hope that their story might not be over after all. The revelation came unexpectedly on a quiet Tuesday morning, 8 days after Jake's surgery. Sarah was reviewing patient charts when Sergeant Thompson approached her with a concerned expression. "Doc, I need to talk to you about the lieutenant commander," Marcus said, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "He's been asking questions about you," Lots of questions. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What kind of questions? Where you're from, where you trained, how long you've been deployed. The kid accidentally mentioned that you were from San Francisco, and ever since then, the lieutenant commander's been acting strange. Real strange. Sarah set down her clipboard, her hands trembling slightly. She had known this moment would come, but she had hoped to have more control over when and how the truth emerged. Yesterday, he asked Alex to find out your first name, Marcus continued. When Alex came back and told him it was Sarah, I thought the lieutenant commander was going to have some kind of medical episode. His heart rate spiked, and he got real pale. Had to call for one of your nurses. The game was over. There was no way Jake hadn't put the pieces together by now. Dr. Sarah Chen from San Francisco was not exactly a common combination. Sarah had been living on borrowed time, and that time had finally run out. Is he asking to see me? Sarah asked, already knowing the answer. Marcus nodded. Been asking all morning. We tried to tell him you were busy with other patients, but he's not buying it. He knows, Doc, and I think we deserve to know what's going on here. Sarah looked at Jake's team members, these brave men who had accepted her without question and trusted her completely with their commander's life. They deserved the truth, even if it was complicated and painful. Lieutenant Commander Morrison and I knew each other before, Sarah said carefully. We have a history that's complicated. How complicated? Marcus asked, his eyes narrowing with protective suspicion. Sarah took a deep breath. We were engaged to be married 3 years ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus, Rabbit, Alex, Tommy, and the rest of Jake's team stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to confusion to something that might have been anger. You were engaged to our lieutenant commander, and you didn't think that was something we should know? Rabbit asked, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by cold suspicion. It ended badly, Sarah explained. Very badly. I didn't want that history to interfere with his medical care. I wanted to make sure he got the best treatment possible, regardless of our past. That's why you've been avoiding him, Alex said, understanding dawning in his voice. All these days we thought you were just busy, but you've been hiding from him. Tommy stepped forward, his young face tight with anger. So what happened? You break his heart and then show up here to finish the job? Tommy, Marcus warned. But Sarah held up her hand. It's okay, she said. He has a right to ask. We all do. She looked at each of their faces, seeing the fierce loyalty they felt for Jake reflected in their expressions. Jake chose his military career over our relationship. He felt his duty to the Navy, to teams like yours, was more important than our plans for marriage. It hurt. It hurt more than anything I'd ever experienced. So you came here for revenge? Rabbit asked. Sarah felt a flash of anger. I came here to serve my country and to help wounded warriors. I came here to use my skills to save lives. I had no idea Jake was deployed in this region, no idea I would ever see him again. When he came in on that stretcher, bleeding and unconscious, I had a choice to make. I could let personal feelings interfere with my duty as a doctor, or I could do everything in my power to save his life. And what did you choose? Marcus asked, though his tone had softened slightly. I saved him, Sarah said simply, because despite everything that happened between us, despite all the hurt and anger, I still couldn't bear the thought of losing him forever. The team exchanged glances, processing this information. Sarah could see them struggling with conflicting emotions, loyalty to their commander, uncertainty about her motives, and perhaps a growing understanding of the complexity of the situation. He needs to see you, Marcus said finally. He's been beating himself up for days, thinking he's going crazy because he recognizes your voice but can't place you. It's not helping his recovery. Sarah nodded. I know. I was hoping to wait until he was stronger. But I think that decision has been taken out of my hands. As Sarah walked toward Jake's bedside, her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times over the past week, but now that it was actually happening, all her carefully planned words seemed inadequate. Jake was sitting up in bed, looking stronger than he had since the surgery, but with an expression of intense concentration on his face. When he saw her approaching, his eyes widened with recognition and something that might have been relief. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hello, Jake," she replied, settling into the chair beside his bed. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, taking in the changes that 3 years had wrought. Jake looked older, more weathered by his experiences in combat. There were new scars on his visible skin, and his eyes held a depth of weariness that hadn't been there before. But he was still fundamentally the man she had fallen in love with, strong, intelligent, and possessed of an inner integrity that drew people to him. "You saved my life," Jake said finally. "I did my job," Sarah replied. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Because I wanted to make sure you got the best medical care possible. I was afraid that if you knew it was me, it might complicate things, make you uncomfortable or reluctant to accept treatment." Jake was quiet for a moment, processing this. "How long have you been deployed here?" 4 months, Sarah said. "This is my first deployment." "What made you decide to come to Afghanistan?" Jake asked, though something in his voice suggested he might already suspect the answer. Sarah met his eyes directly. "You did," she said honestly. "After our engagement ended, I felt lost. I had built my whole life around the idea of our future together, and when that fell apart, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. I was angry, hurt, confused. But over time, I began to understand something." "What?" "I began to understand why you made the choice you did," Sarah continued. "I began to see that your commitment to your duty, to protecting others, wasn't a betrayal of our love. It was an expression of the very character that made me fall in love with you in the first place. So I decided that if I couldn't be with you, maybe I could at least understand you. Maybe I could serve something bigger than myself." Jake's eyes filled with tears. "Sarah, I'm not finished," she said gently. "Being here, seeing what you and men like you face every day, witnessing the sacrifices you make, it's changed me. I understand now that love isn't about asking someone to choose between their duty and their heart. Real love is about supporting each other in fulfilling both." Jake reached for her hand, and Sarah didn't pull away. His touch was warm and familiar, even after all this time. "I never stopped loving you," Jake said. "Not for a single day. But I convinced myself that I had done the right thing, that you were better off without me. I told myself that you would find someone who could give you the life you deserved. And I convinced myself that you had never really loved me at all," Sarah replied. "That if you had, you wouldn't have been able to walk away." "I was an idiot," Jake said. "I was so focused on protecting you from the uncertainty and danger of military life that I never stopped to ask what you wanted. I made the decision for both of us." "We were both young," Sarah said. "We both made mistakes." They sat in silence for a while, hands intertwined, processing the weight of 3 years of separation and misunderstanding. Around them, the medical tent continued its steady rhythm of activity, but for Sarah and Jake, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, and the conversation they should have had years ago. "What happens now?" Jake asked finally. Sarah had been asking herself the same question. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know if we can go back to what we were. Too much has happened. Too much has changed." "Maybe we can't go back," Jake said. "But maybe we can go forward. Maybe we can build something new, something stronger than what we had before." Sarah felt hope bloom in her chest, but she forced herself to be realistic. "You're still active duty. You still have the same commitments, the same responsibilities, and I have my own career, my own path now." "Then we figure it out together," Jake said. We find a way to support each other's dreams instead of asking each other to sacrifice them. Over the following days, as Jake's physical recovery progressed, he and Sarah began the more delicate process of emotional healing. They talked for hours about the years they had spent apart, the lessons they had learned, the people they had become. Jake shared stories of his deployments, the missions that had tested him, the men he had lost. Sarah told him about her work at the children's hospital, her decision to deploy, the satisfaction she found in combat medicine. Jake's team members, initially suspicious and protective, gradually warmed to the situation as they witnessed the positive effect the reconciliation had on their commander. Marcus, in particular, seemed to approve of Sarah's direct, no-nonsense approach to both medicine and relationships. "She's good for him," Marcus told the others one evening as they watched Jake and Sarah talking quietly in the recovery area. "I haven't seen the lieutenant commander this relaxed in years." The news of Jake's injuries had reached the upper levels of military command, and orders soon came through for his medical evacuation to Germany for more extensive treatment and recovery. The thought of separation so soon after finding each other again was painful for both Sarah and Jake, but they were determined not to let geography derail their second chance. "I'll be back," Jake promised as they prepared him for transport. "When my recovery is complete, when I'm cleared for duty, I'll request deployment back to this region." "And I'll be here," Sarah replied. "My contract runs for another 8 months. We'll make it work." As the medical evacuation helicopter lifted off, carrying Jake toward the first stage of his journey home, Sarah stood in the desert dust and watched until the aircraft disappeared into the harsh blue sky. She felt Sergeant Thompson approach and stand beside her. "You know he's going to move heaven and earth to get back here," Marcus said. "I know," Sarah replied. "And I'm going to be here when he does." "Think it'll work this time?" Marcus asked. "You and the lieutenant commander?" Sarah considered the question carefully. 3 years ago, she and Jake had been two people trying to fit their relationship into predetermined molds, unwilling to bend or adapt to each other's needs. Now they were both different people, scarred by separation, shaped by service, and hopefully wiser about what really mattered. "I think we have a chance," Sarah said finally. "We understand each other better now. We understand what we're both willing to sacrifice and what we're not willing to give up." As the weeks passed, Sarah threw herself back into her work with renewed purpose. She performed surgeries, treated wounded soldiers, and saved lives with the same skill and dedication she had always shown. But now there was something else driving her, the knowledge that she was serving not just her country, but the same cause that had claimed Jake's devotion. Letters and emails flew back and forth between Sarah in Afghanistan and Jake in Germany, then later at a Navy medical facility in San Diego. They shared details of their recoveries, his physical, hers emotional, and made plans for their future. It wasn't the same future they had planned 3 years ago, but it was one built on a foundation of understanding and mutual respect. Jake's recovery progressed well, though he would carry scars from his injuries for the rest of his life. Sarah's deployment continued without major incident, though she found herself changed by every patient she treated, every life she saved or lost. 6 months after Jake's evacuation, Sarah received word that a new SEAL team was being deployed to her forward operating base. Her heart raced as she read the personnel list and saw a familiar name: Lieutenant Commander Jacob Morrison, cleared for limited duty. The reunion took place on another hot desert morning, with the same helicopters whirring overhead and the same dust swirling in the air. But this time, when Jake stepped off the aircraft, he was walking under his own power, and Sarah was there to meet him openly, without deception or hesitation. "Welcome back," Sarah said as Jake approached her across the landing zone. "Good to be back," Jake replied. And then, without caring who was watching or what regulations might say about public displays of affection, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. His team members, both old and new, watched with broad grins as their commander finally got his happy ending. And in the harsh desert of Afghanistan, two people who had lost each other and found themselves began to build a love story worthy of the sacrifices they had both made in service to something greater than themselves. The war would continue, dangers would persist, and challenges lay ahead. But Sarah and Jake faced them together, understanding at last that true love didn't require choosing between duty and devotion. It meant finding a way to honor both.